Hey, so I've already teased it out that we've got a very, very VIP speaker today. One of our external teaching team members, actually. This is the one and only Marcy Painter coming to us from Gateway Church in Melbourne. And we're going to just over these next couple of weeks insert a little mini-series really around this idea of what it looks like to be a disciple of Jesus and a growing disciple of Jesus. So starting right now, here's our very good friend, the great Massey Painter.
Good morning, Elevate, and thank you so much for inviting us back into your lives. And we're going to be just spending a couple of weeks talking about the narrow way. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the fact that there's a narrow way and a broad way, and a lot of people find the broad way, but the narrow way can be found, but only a few walk it. And I know when I was growing up, that was taught to me that the broad way was for people who don't believe in God, and the narrow way was for people who do believe in God. But scholars actually say that that's not the correct way to interpret that. Because when Jesus was speaking to the crowd, everybody believed in God. The broad way was for those who believed in God but didn't really allow it to change their lives. The narrow way was for those who wanted to be disciples of Jesus, who wanted to be obedient to the way he calls us to live. So we're going to start today by looking at some aspects of the narrow way. And I want to start by giving you perhaps a vision of what it looks like to walk the narrow way, and then maybe what it doesn't look like. A story from a reasonably forgettable book I picked up at the airport last week. My mother asked me 2 days ago if I would deliver the eulogy at my father's funeral today. I told her I didn't feel comfortable, that I might be crying too hard to speak in front of a crowd, but that was a lie. I just didn't want to do it because I feel that eulogies should be delivered by those who respected the deceased, and I didn't much respect my father. Did you do it? Yep, this morning. You want to hear it? Absolutely. I had no idea what to say. About an hour before the funeral, I told my mother I didn't want to do it. She said it was simple and that my father would have wanted me to do it. She said all I had to do was walk up to the podium and say 5 great things about my father. So that's exactly what I did. He can tell by the look on my face that it gets worse. Oh no, Lily, what did you do? Here, let me reenact it for you. Hello, my name is Lily Bloom, daughter of the late Andrew Bloom. Thank you all for coming and joining us today as we mourn his loss. I wanted to take a moment to honour his life by sharing with you 5 great things about my father. The first thing, I look down at him and shrug. That's it? What do you mean? I stood up there for 2 solid minutes without saying another word. There wasn't one great thing I could say about that man, so I just stared silently at the crowd until my mother realised what I was doing and had my uncle remove me from the podium. Wow. I've been thinking a lot about funerals and eulogies lately. There was a family at our church just in the last week that lost a beloved dad and pop. And I asked them how the funeral went. Well, it couldn't be more different from what I've just read. The man who had died was someone who knew Jesus personally. It was the kids and the grandchildren said that it was a wonderful day, that he had been honoured, that his family had been joyful because They knew where he was. They spoke of the godly influence that he had had on his family and how his children had felt loved and how his grandchildren had seen the legacy that had come down through the generations. So different, such a contrast. Two people living their lives in ways that affected people in opposite ways. One walking the narrow road, one walking the broad path. But I read something in this beautiful book called Psalms Now this week that really challenged me. It's like a contemporary retelling of the Psalms. I read this. "O God, I come to you in sorrow and shame." Obviously, this person's done something bad. "I spoke up in my own defense today." Hang on, isn't that something we're supposed to do? "I spoke up in my own defense and uttered words that knifed their way into the heart of my friend, and this created a great rift between us. I would never raise my hand to strike anybody, but the tongue is more destructive than the fist, and I hurt the one I love. Heal the hurt of my friend, O Lord, and heal the sickness within my heart that forced my foolish tongue into such irresponsible actions. I come to claim your loving mercy. I pray as well that you grant my friend the grace to forgive me. May your Spirit who abides in my heart curb and control my rebellious tongue and teach me to speak words that give life and promote love." I ask myself, is that me? Is that the sort of person that you are? Are you full of that much grace? Well, when we walk in the narrow way of Jesus, that's the vision that we're aiming at. A life steeped in love that overflows in patience and self-control and generosity and gratitude and kindness and strength and compassion and humility and forgiveness. And if we want to be more like Jesus, we have to get a vision of ourselves, what we could be if we were fully formed by God. You know, it's like someone wanting to lose weight who puts a photo of their thinner self on the fridge. It's like, that's my vision, that's what I want to be. But of course, we're talking about so much more important than weight loss here. Let this verse sink in. This is from 2 Corinthians. When someone becomes a Christian, he becomes a brand new person inside. He is not the same anymore. A new life has begun. Just think about that. If you're a follower of Christ, when you became a Christian, you became a new person. You're not the same anymore. What is there about you that you would want to change? If you're like me, I've got a list. Here's the amazing news. Jesus gave us a new way to be human. At the core of our being, he says we are holy, godly, compassionate, generous, and loving. We have a new nature, that of the God who created us. But now we need to put some things in place to learn to live that way. Now, let's be honest, all of us struggle to live up to that image of the new creation that Jesus says we are. It's like, but Jesus has saved us. Why aren't we perfect? Why doesn't he just zap us? I would love to be zapped. The salvation we accepted when we said yes to Jesus is not a call to a zap. It's a call to follow, to be an apprentice. Is any apprentice a master craftsman on day one? Of course not. We have work to do. But you might say, isn't it all about what Jesus has done for us? Yes. We cannot impress God with our goodness. We cannot work our way into heaven. But after we accept Christ's free gift of salvation, we need to cooperate with him to let the new creation we are be seen. It's called the process of sanctification. Dallas Willard's famous statement, so important, the gospel is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning. And remember, I think I showed you earlier this picture of what I call the barcode Christians. It's like we have this idea that maybe all we have to do at some time in our life to put our hand up and make an intellectual assent. Yes, I believe in Jesus. And then we think, yes, we're a Christian. We don't need to do anything else, make any other changes to our life. And when we enter the pearly gates, God's just going to run his scanner across the barcode on our forehead. Yep, you're in. I don't think that's what the scriptures talk about at all. If you remember Christ's teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, the very last picture that he paints in that sermon is about the man who built his house on the rock. And Jesus says that that's like building his house on on the teachings of Jesus. And it was battered by the storms, but it stayed strong. But notice who built the house. Jesus didn't build that house for the man. Jesus didn't build it. It was the man who built it. The man built his house on the rock. To build a house requires effort and discipline. We are not just consumers of Jesus' goodness, we are apprentices of his way. John Mark Comer says this in his book, Practicing the Way. There is a way of life modelled personally by Jesus himself that is far beyond anything else on offer in this world. It can open you up to God's presence and power in ways most people only dream, but it requires you to follow a path marked out for you by Jesus himself, the narrow way. The broad way is that of the majority culture. Follow the crowd and do whatever you want. Billions of people live that way, but it does not lead them to life. Instead, it often leads to destruction. It leads to countless stories of people falling to pieces and never reaching their promise or potential. But Jesus called us to eternal life, which describes not just quantity, but the quality of life. This eternal life is a new way to be human through union with God, beginning now and stretching out over the horizon of death into forever. Jesus was constantly offering this life to any who would follow him. I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. I really, really want that. Do you? And you know what the best news is? Jesus believes in us. He believes that we can be all he knows we can be. We can be like him, loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, the kind of person who keeps their deep joy in the most difficult circumstances, one who is free of the emotional need for everything to go their own way, one who can even have the power of the Spirit working within them to do the things that Jesus did. Jesus promised he would be with us to the end of the age. We are not on our own. I want that. Do you? Now, I said the good news is that it's possible. The reality check is that it's not inevitable. It will not happen by accident. There are no accidental saints. It takes commitment and effort from us in order for us to order our entire life around following Jesus as our top priority. Over our job, our money, our reputation, over everything. Yet when we do that, all these other things will fall beautifully into their proper place. Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount, make your top priority God's kingdom and his way of life, and all these things will be given to you as well. So let's get down to some good stuff. How do we walk the narrow road? Well, I want to give you 3 statements that are going to take us a few weeks to unpack, and Jacob and Beth are going to add to them, but I don't want you to forget these three because they're the essence of following Jesus. We need to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what Jesus does. And there is an order to them. In order to do what Jesus does, we have to become like him. And we will only become like him if we learn to be with him. All right, let me say a word about change. And here's some information that might be quite well known by you, or it might just blow your mind. God doesn't lie to us or tease us with promises or ideas that he knows are impossible for us to fulfill. If God says we are a new creation when we submit our lives to him, then we can change. We can become a new creation. And how do we do that? Romans 12:2 has a really, really great statement there. Paul says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person. How? By changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. Did you know that you can change the way you think? There is a lot of studies have been going on for many years, but we're learning more and more about the neuroplasticity of the brain. That's a big word. What it means is that the brain is not fixed like concrete. It's like plastic. It can be molded. It can be taught. It can be changed. It can be reformed. Now, when my kids were little, I used to teach them something, and I didn't realize I was teaching them profound neuroscience. Here's what I used to say to them. They both did piano lessons, and they'd often get very frustrated when a new piece of music was put in front of them. And, they'd start with two fingers just trying to play bang, 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 bang. It sounded terrible, and they knew it. And they'd try for a little bit and then often, slam the piano lid down and walk away. I'll never get this. But I'd sit them down and say, when you're learning something new, imagine that there's a field with weeds in it. And you want to push a path through that field. So you start pulling out a few weeds. Like every time you practice, you're pulling out a few weeds. And then you practice a bit more and you pull a few more weeds out. And then maybe after you've practiced that piece for a week, we've actually got a rough path going through that field. And then the more and more you practice, that path becomes a road. And then after a couple of weeks of practice, it's like a freeway. And they don't even need the music anymore. It has been so entrenched in their brain, they have forged new neural pathways. And they can now play that piece as if it's always been in their mind. Now, I'll show you an image. A girlfriend of mine's just finished a doctorate on neuroplasticity. And this is one of the visual images that she used to describe what I've just been saying to my kids about the piano. And this is something that is being proved by people who study the brain now. We can change the way we think by putting in practices and habits that actually realign the neurons in our brain, and they take something that was really hard and make it easy. When God said we can change or renew our minds, he was just describing the way the brain he created actually works. Through habits, practices, disciplines that we put into our lives, we can change the way we think. We have parts of our brain that react immediately. They're like our fight or flight mechanisms in our brain. And there are other parts that operate sort of after the immediate reaction when there is a bit more time to apply reason. Now, let me give you an example. I was putting on my coat the other day and I felt this little tickle on the back of my neck, and I thought, my brain said, that's a spider, and I'm going like this. And then my rational brain clicks in and I realise, oh, it was just my collar. That's the two sides of my brain working. Now, when someone says something to you that you might find rude and disrespectful, what's your first reaction? For most people, it's to get angry straight away. And if we don't have Jesus in our life, if we don't have any renewal of our mind, most people will just stay in that angry place. You were rude to me, so that's it. You're cancelled. Maybe if we've walked with Jesus a little longer, maybe we move from that angry place to a place of a bit more reason where we think, okay, let's put down the anger and let's try and get to the bottom of what was going on in that person's life that they were rude. Can you imagine getting to a place where our mind was so renewed by godly habits that we don't react immediately with anger at all, but with compassion and the desire to understand? Oh, that person's been really rude and disrespectful. What is happening in their life that would cause them to be like that? Now that's a renewed mind. But it would take work to cut that path through the forest. I really want to be that renewed mind. I wonder if you do too. So the first step in getting there is to learn to be with Jesus. The word the scriptures give is the word abide, which means to remain, to dwell, to stay. Jesus said, "Remain in me and I will remain in you, for a branch cannot produce fruit if it's severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me." So how do we stay with Jesus? You know, I love being in worship every week. I love worshipping in the house of God. And I feel so connected with God when I'm there. But we can't stay there all week. How do we stay with Jesus in our everyday world? Well, let me take you on a thought journey here. What is the default setting of your mind? Where do you go when your mind is not occupied on a task? For instance, in the shower, waiting at the bus stop. You know, most of us reach for our phones because we can't seem to cope with just letting our minds wander freely. For some, it's too stressful, or they feel like there's monkeys dancing in their brain. I've heard someone describe it as. But imagine if the default setting of our brain was to pray, to talk to Jesus constantly about what we're seeing and doing. Imagine if you were capable of being in two places at once, like eating breakfast and talking to Jesus, driving and talking to Jesus, fixing a pipe and talking to Jesus, making a coffee, changing a nappy and talking to Jesus. Apprenticeship to Jesus is about turning our bodies into temples. That concept just blows me away. A temple is a meeting place between heaven and earth, a place where God is fully at home. What an incredible opportunity to allow God to make a home in us. I want that. Do you? Can we turn God into a habit? Can He become the default setting of our mind? Can He be the place like our north, our true north that the compass returns to? Can we learn to abide? Well, the answer to that is yes. Brother Lawrence was a monk during the 1600s. He wrote a very famous Christian book called Practicing the Presence of God. And he wasn't a highly esteemed preacher or a leader in his order. He was a kitchen hand. He was a dishwasher. But he learned this. He knew about neuroplasticity, although of course he didn't use that word. He knew that with practice he could change the way he thought. He learned over time how to direct his thoughts to Jesus constantly. And slowly it moved from something he had to work his will towards, like pulling a few weeds out, to something that came naturally. It turned into a highway in his mind. He turned God into a habit. And when we start this, it can be a frustration, as a million things will fill our minds. But over time, the wiring of your brain will begin to change and new neural pathways will form. And the more you pray, the more you will think to pray. There is so much we can't do in our spiritual formation. We cannot fix or transform ourselves, but we can do this. We can be with Jesus. We can pause for little moments throughout our days and turn our hearts towards Jesus with silent prayer and love. You know what the simplest form of prayer is? I want to teach it to you right now. Would you close your eyes with me just for a minute? And just use that gift of imagination that God has given you. Imagine you are looking at Jesus, however he looks to you. And then I want you to imagine him looking back at you with love. And that's it. So simple. The simplest form of prayer. There's a few practical things that I want to suggest that you could do this week. One is you could set just a gentle hourly alarm on your phone. Every time that alarm goes off, it'll just remind you, just take your mind back to God. Even that imagination that I just gave you, looking at Jesus, looking back at you with love. Maybe replace some of the noise or that's going on in your life with worship music. Maybe even for just this week, instead of listening to the constant news cycle on your way to work, perhaps put on some worship music and see how that changes the way that you feel. There is a beautiful app called Lectio 365. I'm going to put an image on the screen now with a QR code. You can download this app for free. And it's designed, the Lectio Divino is a method of sitting and meditating with Scripture. It has been used by Christians down through the ages. And this one allows you probably 6 or 7 minutes to listen to. You can listen to it morning, noon, night, and just sink into the presence of God. Just for this week, why don't you listen to it as you go to bed at night? It will start to change the way you think. And as you change the way you think, you start to be transformed into the new creation that God created you to be. Well, next week, Jacob's going to talk to us a bit about becoming like Jesus. Thanks, Elevate. God bless.